Elias Barone owned 32 rooms in a townhouse in the North End, and for 3 years he hadn't slept a decent night in a single one of them. In Boston, men stood up when he walked into a room before they'd even looked to see who was with him. A call he didn't return could freeze a shipping contract for 3 days. Nobody sat at his table unless he'd asked them to, not even the man who'd guarded him for 11 years. That was the kind of power he had, and none of it had been worth a dime on the night his 12-year-old sister didn't come home. So when his people flagged the new night maid as a security risk, 6 weeks on the job and always in the wrong hallway at the wrong hour, Elias didn't send anybody. He got in the car himself at 5 in the morning and followed her. He told himself he was hunting a leak. Adeline Hayes was 27, and she rode 3 buses to get home, almost 90 minutes from the North End out to Chelsea. She fell asleep twice and jerked awake both times, her hand tight around a paper bag of leftover bread she'd taken from his kitchen. She stopped at a pharmacy, counted coins in her palm for a long time, and bought the smallest box on the shelf. Elias followed her into an old walk-up and climbed to the 4th floor, and that's where he stopped, because the door of apartment 4C hung open on a hinge nobody had bothered to fix. The room behind it wasn't much bigger than his closet. There was a bed against a damp wall, and on it sat a thin 16-year-old boy with a bandage still taped to his wrist, typing something on a second-hand laptop. He shut the screen fast when he heard his sister come in, the way people do when they're hiding something. She set the bag down, took off her shoes, and smiled. It was the first time Elias had seen her smile in 6 weeks. But it wasn't the room that made him grab the stair rail. And it wasn't the boy. It was the photograph taped to the wall above the bed, a man standing beside a black sedan with a plate number Elias could recite in his sleep. That was the driver who'd died the same night his sister did. 3 years, and not one person from the Barone family had ever knocked on this door. Elias stood in that hallway a long time doing math he didn't want to do, because there was one thing about that night he'd never told anyone. Not his grandmother, not the police, not the men who worked for him. He was supposed to be in that car. If you're the kind of person who believes the truth eventually finds the door it's looking for, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. It really does make all the difference. Now let's go back to that 4th floor hallway, because what Elias Barone did next cost him everything he'd spent his whole life building. 6 weeks before the night he drove out to Chelsea, Elias Barone sat at the head of the table in the small dining room behind the kitchen, the room he still used for matters that didn't need to be written into any ledger. Dinner had already been served. The man sitting across from him was named Callahan, and he had handled the books for the family's logistics branch since Elias's father was still alive, and now he was telling a joke about his nephew, telling it louder than necessary, laughing before he even reached the part that was supposed to be funny. Elias let him finish. He never interrupted anyone. He simply sat there with both hands resting on the table, and when the laughter faded, the entire room suddenly became quiet enough to hear the clock on the wall. Bruno stood by the door. He had been standing there throughout the entire meal, never sitting down, never touching a plate, exactly as he had for 11 years. Elias reached toward the chair beside him, placed a yellow envelope with worn corners on the table, then slowly pushed it across the wood toward Callahan, the way someone might slide a glass of water toward a guest. He said nothing while Callahan opened it. There was no money inside, no hidden photographs. Nothing people usually imagine would be inside an envelope, pushed across a table in a room like that. There was only a copy of the lease for the house in Revere that Callahan had always claimed belonged to his wife's brother, an enrollment document for his daughter at a school in Newton, and beneath those, 2 printed pages, bearing the name of someone on the south side of the city, along with the dates and times of 3 meetings. Callahan didn't finish reading. He only had to reach the 3rd page before his hand began to shake, and the trembling spread all the way up into his shoulder. He opened his mouth to say something, and Elias raised one hand, not high, only lifting his palm about a hand's width above the table, and that was enough. Elias said he'd been holding that envelope since spring. He said that through all those months, he'd continued sitting across from Callahan at this very table, continued asking about his daughter, continued allowing him to approve whatever payments he wanted to approve, and asked if Callahan knew why. Callahan shook his head. Elias said it was because he wanted to see how long a man could keep lying while being fed well and treated kindly. He said now he knew. No one in the room raised his voice. No one stood up. The clock on the wall kept ticking, and Bruno remained at the door like a second door. Callahan began talking about the debt, about his wife, about how he would repay every dollar. and Elias let him finish, exactly as he had let him finish the joke earlier. Then he pulled the school enrollment paper from the stack, folded it in half, and pushed it back toward Callahan by itself. He said the girl would stay in school. He said he didn't touch schools, didn't touch hospitals, didn't touch churches, and that didn't change because of what kind of man her father happened to be. Callahan looked up at him, and for one very brief second, something like gratitude appeared on his face, something Elias saw and refused to accept. He said the rest was different. He said the name on those other 2 pages would be passed to the people who needed to know. The books would be audited all the way back to the beginning of spring, and starting tomorrow morning, Callahan would no longer have the authority to sign anything bearing the Barone name. Then he said one final thing, no louder than anything he'd said before, that Callahan would stand up and walk out on his own, because Elias didn't want to have to ask Bruno to help him do it in the same room where Callahan's daughter had once sat eating cake. Callahan stood. He took the school enrollment paper, left the envelope behind, and walked out on his own 2 feet. The door closed very softly. Elias remained seated for a while longer, pulled the envelope back toward himself, slipped the remaining 2 pages inside, then stood and turned off the light. At the door, Bruno asked whether he wanted someone to follow Callahan out to his car. Elias said no. He said people only run when they still believe there's somewhere left to run. Word of what happened to Callahan took less than 2 days to spread beyond the family, and by the end of the week, the Hallorans knew. Elias understood that immediately on Monday morning, when 2 barges belonging to a company on the south side of the city planted themselves squarely across the entrance to the family's 4th dock, with no paperwork, no explanation, and stayed there for 3 straight days. The dock manager called to report that their stevedores had suddenly begun calling out in large numbers, that the trucking company that had hauled for the Barone family since his father's time had abruptly claimed it was unavailable, that someone had gone around and spoken to every one of them. Cormac Halloran didn't hit anyone. He simply stepped into the exact place where the Barone family was bleeding, put his foot down, and waited. The meeting took place in the 2nd floor office. 6 men, no one taking notes. The first wanted to send trucks to block the entrance to Halloran's docks in retaliation. The second said that would bring the port police into it, and both sides would go down together. Rourke Delaney sat at the far end of the table with his hands clasped, and he waited until everyone had finished speaking before he said a word, exactly the way he'd done for all those years, in this very room, going back to the days when he sat at the right hand of Elias's father. Rourke said striking the docks would be expensive and slow. He said Cormac Halloran was the kind of man who only stopped when he felt pain somewhere no one dared touch, and Rourke had a way to end this within a week. Then he named a private school on the north side which Cormac's 2 grandchildren attended, and he said they didn't have to do anything at all. They only had to let the Halloran family know that the Barones knew. Someone in the room nodded. Elias didn't. He set down his pen, and the entire table fell silent, because the sound of it touching the wood was clearer than anything that had just been said. He asked Rourke how long he'd been sitting in this room. Rourke said he'd been sitting there since before Elias knew how to read. Elias said then he ought to remember the rule his father had placed above the head of the table, and if he'd forgotten it, Elias would repeat it once today so everyone could hear. The Barone family doesn't touch schools, doesn't touch hospitals, doesn't touch churches. He said his father hadn't established those 3 rules out of kindness, and if anyone sitting there believed that, then that person had never understood the old man for a single day. He said his father had made them for one very simple reason, that when people were in those 3 places, they were there because they had nowhere else left to run, and anyone who took even that last refuge from another human being would eventually find those people coming back to bite into his throat. And when that day came, no wall, no door, no man standing guard would be able to save him. He said he'd rather lose 3 docks than lose that line. Rourke lowered his head and said he understood, his voice as calm as a man who'd just suggested changing the paper used to print invoices. The meeting was nearly over when he opened his briefcase, took out a sheet of paper, and said there was one more thing. He said the last 3 shipments had been followed at exactly the stretches where only someone who knew the routes could have kept up with them, and that wasn't Halloran luck. He said the problem was inside the family. Elias asked what he wanted. Rourke said he wanted the entire list of people entering and leaving the estate tightened up, every shift reviewed, and the whole camera system checked again, including the places no one had bothered looking at for years. Elias agreed and ordered it done that week. Then he asked whether anyone on the list stood out. Rourke looked down at the paper, and the first name he read aloud was the newly hired night maid, a woman who'd been working there for a little over a month, named Adeline Hayes. The name stayed in Elias's mind the way a grain of sand stays inside a shoe. Not painful enough to make a person stop walking, but never quite going away either. That night, he didn't go upstairs to his bedroom. He sat in the small room beside the library, where a monitor was connected to the estate's old security camera system, something no one had bothered to review all the way through since his father died. He told himself he would only watch for an hour. He stayed until nearly dawn. The woman named Adeline Hayes appeared in the upper left corner of the screen at close to 10 o'clock at night, pushing a cleaning cart into the first-floor hallway, and the first thing Elias noticed wasn't what she did, but what she didn't do. She never sat down. There was no one left in the house except his grandmother in the east wing, and the cook had gone home long before. The entire first floor was dark and empty, with a whole row of upholstered chairs lining the wall that no one had touched in 3 years. Yet she remained on her feet the entire time. She finished mopping the hallway, leaned against the handle for about half a minute, then straightened and kept moving. Elias fast-forwarded to the night before, then the night before that. The same thing. He switched to the shifts of other employees for comparison, and he watched people sit down, make phone calls, eat half a pastry on the stairs, perfectly ordinary things he'd never cared about before, and had no intention of caring about now. Only that woman stayed standing. The next morning, he called the housekeeper and asked about the schedule. She said Miss Hayes had picked up 2 extra weekend shifts starting the previous month, and even after she was told it wasn't necessary, she'd still asked to take them. The housekeeper said it as though she were praising someone for being hardworking, and Elias heard something else in it, though he couldn't yet put a name to what it was. He asked whether there had been any complaints about her. The housekeeper said no. Quite the opposite. That she was the only person in the house who asked permission before turning on a light in any room, even at 2 o'clock in the morning, even when there was no one there to ask. She said the first time it happened, she thought the woman was being sarcastic, but later realized it was simply a habit. That evening, Elias opened the monitor again. He watched her clean the staircase railing with both hands, one holding it steady, the other wiping, slowly and evenly, never skipping a section, not even the part hidden behind a column where no one would ever see it. He watched her pass the small dining room behind the kitchen, the room where he'd pushed the envelope across the table to Callahan, and she stopped in the doorway, looked inside, then continued without turning on the light. Then came the 4th night. The basement camera was the oldest in the house, the picture blurred and skipping frames, and Elias nearly ignored it because he thought the camera was malfunctioning, but then he realized the shadow moving through the image wasn't interference. She was walking along the basement corridor very slowly, far more slowly than she moved on the floors above, and she wasn't pushing her cleaning cart. At every door, she stopped. She didn't open any of them. She only stood there for a few beats, and Elias enlarged the image until it broke apart into grains, just enough to see that her lips were moving. She was counting. He couldn't hear her, because the basement camera had no audio, but there was no mistaking the rhythm of it, the rhythm of someone silently repeating a sequence of numbers in their head so they wouldn't forget. She walked the entire row on the left, then turned back and worked her way along the right. When she reached the final door in the northern corner, the door to the records room whose key was kept on the housekeeper's key ring, and which had long been opened only during the year-end inventory, she stopped much longer than before. She raised one hand to the doorknob. She didn't turn it. She only rested her hand there and held it for a long moment, then lowered it and went back upstairs. Elias remained sitting in the darkness for a long time after the screen had gone empty. He thought about what Rourke had said about someone leaking the roots, and he realized he was trying to force those two things together when they simply refused to fit, because an informant didn't remain standing through an entire night shift, and an informant didn't ask permission before turning on a light. Elias didn't tell anyone about what he'd seen in the basement. Not Bruno, not Rourke, especially not Rourke. He told himself he was waiting for more information, and he knew that was the most polite way a person could lie to himself. That Thursday afternoon, the meeting at the port ended earlier than expected, and instead of stopping by the office as he usually did, he told Bruno to drive straight home. He entered through the side door, an entrance he hadn't used in a very long time, and because of that he passed through the service corridor, the narrow hallway running behind the kitchen where the owner of the house had no reason ever to walk. He heard her voice before he saw her. Adeline was standing with her back to the doorway, the phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, one hand still holding the mop, and she was speaking to whoever was on the other end, in a voice so flat that it clearly took effort to keep it that way. She said she understood the policy. She said she wasn't asking for an exemption, only for more time. She said she'd already managed to send part of the payment that month, and she would have the rest. She just needed a few more weeks, and she asked them not to transfer the file somewhere else because that place was too far away and the bus didn't reach it in the morning. Then she was silent for quite a while. Then she said thank you, twice, the second time more softly than the first. She ended the call. She remained standing exactly where she was, still holding the mop, then stepped back and leaned against the wall. She didn't cry. She only closed her eyes and let her head rest against the tiled wall, and Elias stood at the end of the corridor in the shadows and counted 3 breaths, 4 breaths, 5 breaths. On the 6th, she opened her eyes, quickly wiped the back of one hand across her face, straightened, and bent down to continue mopping the exact spot she'd left unfinished, as though the phone call had been nothing more than a brief pause to switch hands. Elias stepped back and took another way upstairs to his study. He sat there until evening without turning on the light, and what bothered him most wasn't what he'd just heard, but the realization that he'd seen that exact posture somewhere before. He'd seen it in the mirror for the past 3 years, every time he allowed himself to lean against something for exactly 5 breaths before standing up and getting back to work. The following night, after midnight, he went down to the kitchen to get some water. The kitchen lights were off, and the only illumination came through the small window above the sink, and Adeline was standing beside the kitchen table, wrapping something in paper. She heard him and turned around, and her entire body went rigid. On the table was half a loaf of bread left from dinner, a portion of sliced cold meat no one had touched, and a paper bag standing open. She put everything down. She said she was sorry. She said it would all be thrown away by morning anyway, but she understood that wasn't an excuse, and she offered to have it deducted from that month's wages, however much he wanted, and if he wanted her to leave that very night, she would. She said all of it quickly, like someone who had rehearsed those words long ago for an evening exactly like this one. Elias said nothing for a while. Then he asked who she was taking it to. She stayed silent. He asked again, no louder and no softer. She still said nothing. She stood straight with both arms at her sides and looked directly at him in the way of someone who had already decided that losing a job was something she could endure, but explaining herself was not. In his life, Elias had sat across from many people in rooms with closed doors, and he knew exactly what a person looked like in the moment before they broke. She didn't break. He waited longer than necessary just to see whether she would, and in the end, he was the one who looked away. He told her to take the food home. He said nothing needed to be deducted. Then he went upstairs without looking back, and behind him he heard the rustle of paper begin again, slower than before. In his room, he stood by the window for a long time before picking up the phone. Bruno answered on the first ring, his voice alert, as though he'd never been asleep. Elias told him to have a car ready the next morning, something no one would notice, parked at the side gate before 5 o'clock. Bruno asked how many men he needed. Elias said none. He said tomorrow he was going himself. The sky was still not fully light when Elias returned to the estate, and he didn't go inside the house. He went around the side, crossed the dew-wet lawn, and walked down to the row of storage buildings behind the garden, where his father had once kept cars and where now there was nothing but dust. He unlocked the last door on the right. Inside there was only one car, covered with a tarp, parked exactly where it had been pushed 3 years earlier. No one was allowed in here. No one asked why. People only knew that the Barone family had a storage building that was always locked, and a man who never spoke about it. And in the world Elias lived in, that was the kind of thing people learned not to ask about. Elias pulled the tarp away. The other car sat there, clean, intact, without a single scratch, because it had returned untouched that night, the car he had driven back safely, leaving behind the black sedan, the one he was truly supposed to have been riding in. He stood looking at it for a long time, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to return to that evening, not to what came afterward, only to the beginning, the part he'd always believed meant nothing. That day, he had a meeting on the north side, and Delphine had a music rehearsal that ended late. Thomas Mercer was standing in the front drive, with a ring of keys in his hand. He had already cleaned both cars, and when Elias came outside, Thomas stepped directly in front of the black sedan's door. Thomas said he would drive the sedan tonight, and the young master should take the other car. Elias told him to move. Thomas didn't. He simply stood his ground, insisting quietly that the young master take the other keys. Elias asked why. Thomas didn't answer. He only stood there, still holding the keys, his eyes lowered toward the toes of his shoes, and he didn't move. Elias remembered very clearly that he'd been irritated. He remembered saying something sharp about who was paying whose wages. He remembered Thomas hearing it and still refusing to move. And finally, because he was late, because he was tired, Elias took the keys to the other car and got in. He didn't ask a third time. Delphine came running out afterward, hugging her music case to her chest, and Thomas opened the rear door for her just as he always did, bending slightly so she wouldn't bump her head. The two cars left the gates a few minutes apart. Thomas's car turned left. Elias turned right. For 3 years, Elias had replayed that change of cars in his head more times than he could count, and every time he stopped at the same place, at the point where he told himself it had been chance, that life sometimes gave you an evening when a stubborn man insisted on switching cars, and everything changed because of it. That if Elias had asked a third time, perhaps he would have been the one who never came home. He had called it coincidence because calling it that had allowed him to keep living. But that morning he'd stood in a 4th-floor hallway in Chelsea. And now, standing inside this storage building, he heard that old sentence with different ears. Thomas Mercer hadn't insisted on changing cars. Thomas Mercer had refused to let him get into that car. A driver didn't stand in his employer's way in the middle of a driveway because of a feeling. A driver who lowered his eyes and refused to explain was a man who knew something he wasn't ready to say, or wasn't certain enough to say, or was waiting until the following morning to say. And whatever that thing had been, it had died with him. Elias felt both of his hands turn cold. For 3 years, he'd searched for the person responsible, torn apart the south side of the city, pressured people, bought information, burned through money, and in all those 3 years, not once, not one single time, had he sat down and asked the simplest question of all, why his driver hadn't wanted him to get into that car. He had never asked who Thomas had left behind either. Elias pulled the tarp back over the sedan, locked the storage door, then stood in the middle of the lawn and made the call. Bruno answered on the first ring. Elias said he wanted every record connected to Thomas Mercer. Everything. From the day he started working for them until his final day. Personnel files, payroll records, shift logs, anything bearing his name. Bruno asked when he needed it. Elias said before breakfast. The file was on his desk before breakfast, exactly as he'd requested, and he read every page while the coffee beside him went cold, untouched. In those papers, Thomas Mercer had been reduced to a series of short lines so spare they felt cruel. Date hired, years of service, no disciplinary record, no excessive leave, and under next of kin there was only the name of his wife, who had died several years before him. No child was listed. Elias turned that page over twice before telling someone to bring her upstairs. Adeline entered the study at close to 9 o'clock, with both hands folded in front of her, and he saw immediately that she'd prepared herself to be fired. She stopped in the middle of the room without coming any closer, and before he could speak, she said that if this was about the other night, she had no excuse. She would leave today, and she wasn't asking for a letter of recommendation. Elias called her to sit down. She didn't. He told her a second time, and this time she lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, her back straight, like someone sitting in a hospital waiting room. He said nothing about the bag of bread. He opened a drawer, took out a small framed photograph that he'd kept face down for 3 years, stood it upright, and turned it toward her. In the picture was a little girl smiling and holding a music case against her chest. He asked whether Adeline knew who the girl was. She looked at the photograph, and he saw her shake her head honestly, the kind of shake that belonged to someone who had never seen that face before. Then he asked the second question. What was her father's name? She looked up. He saw her lips part, then close again. He continued, asking why she had used a different surname on her job application. Her entire body went still, and inside that stillness, something seemed to crack very softly. She said yes. She said when she filled out the application, she used her mother's maiden name because she didn't want anyone asking questions. Elias asked for her father's real name. She said Thomas Mercer, the same name he'd read in the file that morning, and the room became very quiet. He asked whether she knew who he was. She said she knew he was the owner of this house. He asked whether she knew anything beyond that. She said no. She said her father had worked for a family in the North End for years, and had never brought that name home. Not once. Not even over dinner. Not even when her mother asked. She said he only told them that there were some jobs best left where they belonged, at work, because that was safer for everyone. Elias heard that and thought of a man standing in front of a car door refusing to move and refusing to explain. And he understood that all those years Thomas Mercer had built a wall between the two halves of his own life, and that wall had remained standing even after he died. Elias turned the photograph back toward himself. He said the girl in the picture was his younger sister, and that she had been sitting in the car Adeline's father was driving on his final night. Adeline didn't cry out. She only raised one hand to cover her mouth and sat that way for a long time. And when she lowered it, her eyes were red but dry. She said she was sorry. Elias told her she had nothing to apologize for, then asked the next question, the one he'd intended to ask from the moment he finished reading the file. He asked what this family had sent her afterward. She said there had been a check. He asked how much. She said enough to cover the funeral and a few additional months of rent. She said someone delivered it to the house along with a document stating that it was funeral assistance and final settlement, and she had signed it. She said her mother hadn't been gone very long. Then her father was gone too. She was 24 years old, and there was no one left in the house she could ask whether a paper like that was something she ought to sign. Elias called Bruno. By afternoon, Bruno returned, and instead of setting the papers down on the desk, he placed them directly into Elias's hands, something he almost never did. The amount the council had approved for the driver's family hadn't been merely enough to pay for a funeral. It had been enough to change an entire life. Enough for a 24-year-old woman to finish the schooling she'd had to leave incomplete. Enough that no one in that household should ever have needed to take 3 buses at 5 o'clock in the morning. And toward the back of the packet, Adeline Mercer's signature appeared on 3 separate documents. 3 documents containing 3 different statements, even though she had signed only once in her life. The person who approved the payment, the person who supervised it, and the person who certified that the full amount had been transferred all carried the same name. Elias read it, then read it again, and said nothing. Bruno said quietly that to retrieve these records he'd had to go through the bank, and someone there had almost certainly called to report it. That same evening, Rourke Delaney had every lock in the basement replaced, and moved the camera review schedule forward by an entire week. On Sunday afternoon, Elias told Bruno to take him out to Chelsea, and this time he didn't park at the corner. He parked directly in front of the building. Elias walked up 4 flights of stairs, more slowly than he'd expected. And when he reached the final landing, he stopped. Not because he was tired, but because voices were coming through the door with the broken hinge. They weren't ordinary voices. The brother and sister were arguing, and there was something strange about the way they argued, because neither of them was loud. Both were trying to keep their voices down, and because of that, the argument sounded far heavier than shouting ever could. The teenage boy was speaking. He said, "Just look at this. Look at it once, and then if you want me to turn it off, I'll turn it off." Elias heard a laptop being turned around on top of the blanket. The boy said he'd been working on this since the previous fall, adding to it once every week, and he hadn't made up a single line. Then he began reading. Not in a sad voice, but in the dry, matter-of-fact tone of a kid explaining a math problem he'd checked over and over again. He read out the transportation costs. He read the rent. He read the number of extra shifts she'd taken from January until now, and told her not to argue, because he'd recorded them from the schedule taped to the refrigerator, not from what she'd told him. Then he reached the final column, the one he said had taken him the longest to calculate, and he said it was the number of hours she slept. He said there hadn't been a single week all year when she'd gotten enough sleep. He said he'd calculated the average, multiplied it out, then compared it with the amount people said was normal, and he gave her the result in one sentence, that if she dropped just 1 shift a week, only 1, then by the time she reached their mother's age, she would have gotten back that many years of her life. He said those years were real. He wasn't saying it because it sounded good. He said she should take those years and go back to school, go somewhere, do something she actually liked. And he said he'd already asked the hospital about it, that there was another treatment plan that was simpler and required fewer visits, and he wanted to switch to that one. Adeline didn't answer immediately. Standing outside the door, Elias heard something being set down hard. Then she spoke, and for the first time in 6 weeks, he heard her voice rise. She told him to close that computer. She told him to listen to her, and listen once because she wasn't going to say it again. She said she didn't go to work to save him. She said she went to work because when the alarm rang in the morning, there was a reason in that apartment for her to sit up, and that reason was sitting on the bed arguing with her right now. She said if he took that reason away, then what was she supposed to get up for? She said he was very good with numbers, but he'd left out one line, and that line was that, without him, she wouldn't have anything left at all. And if he sat there dividing her life into shifts, then she really was going to be angry with him. Then her voice lowered. She said she didn't need him to save time for her. She needed him to still be here. The room was silent for a long while. Elias waited a little longer, then knocked. Both of them turned toward the door at the same time, and Adeline shot to her feet when she recognized him, her face going pale, one hand instinctively pulling the blanket smooth. Elias didn't step inside. He remained in the doorway and said he'd come to tell them something, and once he'd said it, he would leave. He said the guest house behind the estate had been empty for a long time, that it had its own kitchen and its own entrance, and that he wanted the two of them to move there. He said they could stop paying rent here, and from there it was only one bus to the hospital instead of 3. The teenage boy answered first. He sat up straighter and asked whether Elias was trying to repay a debt or buy peace of mind for himself. Adeline said his name, Micah, in the voice of someone telling him to stop. Elias said to let him ask. Then he said both. He said Micah could choose whichever answer he wanted. Elias didn't care, as long as he stayed. Micah shook his head. He said thank you, but this was their home. He said it was small, but no one owed anyone anything here, and he wanted to keep it that way. Elias looked at him and didn't push. He'd sat across from men 3 times the boy's age in rooms with closed doors, and he knew when pressure would work and when it wouldn't. He was about to turn away when Adeline spoke. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her brother, and she said, "I'm not asking for you. I'm asking for me." She said, "I'm exhausted, Micah. I need to sleep." The boy looked up at his sister, and his face changed in the way a child's face changes, when he suddenly realizes that for all those months, he'd been reading his own spreadsheet, and had somehow missed the one human being sitting directly in front of him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said okay, and that was all he said. The brother and sister moved into the guest house on a Tuesday morning, and everything they owned fit into exactly 2 car trips. Micah didn't comment on the new room, and he didn't thank anyone a second time. The first thing he did was look for a place with a signal. Reception inside the guest house was unreliable. He didn't want to go into the main house, and after 2 days of wandering around the grounds with his laptop tucked under one arm, he found the greenhouse. It was hidden behind a row of trees at the back of the garden. Its iron frame rusted. Several panes of glass in the roof cracked and patched with tape that had yellowed with age. Inside stood a row of pots filled with bone-dry soil, a long wooden table covered in dust, and weeds growing up through the gaps between the bricks. But the signal there was stronger than anywhere else on the property. Micah set his laptop on the wooden table and began doing his work there. By the 3rd day, he started cleaning. He didn't tell anyone, didn't ask anyone's permission, and didn't have any clear reason for doing it. It was simply uncomfortable sitting in all that dust, so he swept. Then he wiped down the table. Then he stacked the broken pots neatly in one corner. Then he reached the long planting bed that ran along the southern wall, where an old lemon tree was still alive, its trunk twisted, its leaves sparse and yellow, struggling among weeds that reached nearly to his knees, and he began pulling the weeds around it. He was bent over doing that when he heard the tap of a cane against the brick floor. Rosalind Barone stood in the greenhouse doorway. Micah knew who she was because his sister had told him, and he also knew that she hadn't left the East Wing in 3 years, because his sister had told him that too. She didn't greet him. She didn't ask who he was, didn't ask what he was doing there, didn't ask who had given him permission to come inside. She simply stood there looking at the planting bed he had cleared halfway, then walked in slowly, her free hand following the edge of the table, and took a pair of pruning shears from her coat pocket. They were small, with wooden handles, the blades worn but still bright, the kind of brightness something only keeps if someone has cleaned it regularly for many years. She placed them in his hand. Then she said she had planted this tree with her granddaughter. She said her granddaughter was gone, but the tree wasn't. She told him to cut away anything that was dry and not to feel sorry for it, because a plant knows what it needs to let go of. Then she turned and walked all the way back down the corridor toward the East Wing without saying another word. Micah stood there holding the shears for a long time before he began cutting. That weekend, Elias found him sitting on the greenhouse steps and asked whether he'd ever driven a car before. Micah said no. Elias tossed him a set of keys and pointed toward the old car parked in the yard. telling him the yard was wide, so if he was going to hit something, he could hit whatever he wanted. Micah made it halfway around before the engine stalled. He started again, and by the fourth attempt, he completed a full circle. Elias sat in the passenger seat with both hands resting on his knees, and it was the first time in 3 years he'd sat inside a moving car with someone other than Bruno behind the wheel. As for Adeline, from the day they moved in, she took on one task no one had assigned her: bringing meals up to the East Wing. For 3 years, the cook had left the tray outside the door and walked away. That was the rule. Adeline was the first person who knocked and waited. The first time, Rosalind didn't open the door. The second time, she did. She looked Adeline up and down, then stepped back once, and that was enough for Adeline to enter. From then on, she went up every week, carrying trays, cleaning the room, changing the towels. Rosalind didn't speak much. Some days, she only sat in the chair by the window and let Adeline do her work. One afternoon, while wiping down the top of the nightstand, Adeline pulled the drawer open so she could clean the inside as well, and she stopped. There was something inside. She looked at it for the space of 2 breaths, then pushed the drawer closed, finished cleaning the rest of the nightstand, and didn't ask a question. When she left, Rosalind was still sitting with her face turned toward the window, and neither woman said anything about it. The new lock in the basement cost Adeline nearly 2 more weeks, and during those 2 weeks she kept doing exactly what she had always done: stayed on her feet through every shift, carried trays up to the East Wing, asked permission before turning on a light. Then Thursday night came, and the housekeeper left early because her grandchild was sick, and she forgot her ring of keys on the hook beside the refrigerator. Adeline stared at them for a long time before taking them down. She went to the basement without the cleaning cart, without carrying anything at all, and she walked straight ahead, no longer stopping at any of the doors, because she had finished counting them long ago. The new lock opened more easily than she expected. Inside the records room was the smell of old paper and cold metal, rows of steel shelves running all the way to the northern wall, each one lined with cardboard boxes arranged by year. She went to the 7th shelf. She knew it was the 7th because her father had once said over dinner, back when she hadn't cared enough to pay attention, that the driver via its shift logs were kept on the 7th shelf from the door, and once the monthly book was turned in, that was the end of it, because no one ever read them anyway. She pulled down the box from that year, set it on the floor, and opened it. The logbooks were lined up side by side with their spines facing upward, each driver's name written in marker along the edge. She looked for her father's name. She found it near the end, and the moment she lifted it, she knew something was wrong, because it was too light. She opened it. The cover was intact, and her father's name was still written in his own handwriting in the upper right corner. Inside, it was empty. Not torn, not missing a few pages. The entire body of the book had been removed, neatly, cleanly, leaving only a few scraps of paper still caught along the staples. Someone had done this a long time ago, had done it carefully, then returned the empty cover to its proper place, so no one counting the books would notice one missing. Adeline sank onto the floor with the empty cover in her hands. At that exact moment, the ceiling lights came on. Bruno stood in the doorway. In his hand was a partially used roll of black tape, the same kind the camera review had found stuffed behind an electrical box at the end of the basement corridor, and he didn't need to say anything because she understood. Elias stepped in behind him. He looked at the empty cover in her hands, then at the roll of tape, then at her. He asked what she was looking for. Adeline stood up. She didn't hide the cover behind her back. Didn't lie. Didn't search for anything to defend herself with. She said she was looking for her father's final month of shift logs. He asked why. She said because the book recorded the route for every trip, who assigned it, who changed it, what time the change was made, and if anyone had altered the route that night, her father would have written it down, because in all the years he'd done that job, he had never missed a single line. Elias asked how long she'd been inside this house. She said a little over 2 months. He asked how many times she'd applied. She was silent for a moment, then said the first time had been 2 years earlier, and she'd applied again every time the house posted an opening until someone finally hired her. He asked whether she knew what that was called. She said she did. Elias didn't ask anything else. He walked around her, left the records room, and she followed him upstairs because there was nothing else she could do. In his study, he didn't sit down. He opened a drawer, took out an envelope, counted into it the rest of her wages through the end of the month, then slowly pushed it across the desk toward her. exactly the way he'd pushed another envelope across that same wooden surface not long before. He said he didn't keep people who lied inside his house. After saying it, he turned away and walked to the window, and he didn't wait for her response. Adeline took the envelope and left. She packed her belongings in 15 minutes. At the gate, when Bruno opened it for her, she stopped and turned back toward the illuminated window on the second floor and called up to it, not very loudly, her voice still as level as it had been that night in the service corridor. She said she'd been knocking on the door of this house for 2 years. She said she'd sent letters, made phone calls, come in person and stood outside the gates, asked to speak with someone, anyone, because she had only one question about the night her father died. She said no one opened the door for the daughter of a driver. She said they only opened the door for a maid. So she became a maid. Then she walked out. Upstairs, Elias remained standing at the window. Bruno came up and asked him about her younger brother. Elias said the boy would stay. No one was to interfere with his treatment, and that was an order. The next morning, the guest house was empty. The beds had been made, the tray had been returned to the kitchen, and the old laptop was gone from the table. And on Elias's desk, placed neatly in the center of the wood, lay the pruning shears with the wooden handles, their blades worn with age, but still bright. 3 weeks passed, and the mansion returned to exactly what it had been before she arrived, so quiet that the ticking clock in the small dining room could be heard all the way at the foot of the stairs. The housekeeper hired 2 new people for the night shift. Both of them sat down when no one was in the house. Both turned on lights without asking permission, and neither of them remained anywhere longer than necessary. The east wing fell completely silent. The cook returned to the old routine, leaving the tray outside the door and walking away, and every afternoon the tray remained untouched until evening. By the 4th day, they began carrying it back downstairs with the food still untouched. During those same days, Adeline got her shifts back at the restaurant on Broadway and asked for additional morning shifts at the laundry, and she went to work on the earliest bus. She sat in the row of seats beside the rear door, where the light was brightest, with Micah's medical records resting on her lap, and she read every page again, even though she already knew them by heart, because she was afraid there might be one line she'd misunderstood all this time. She didn't bring the pruning shears with her. She didn't ask her brother why he'd left them on Elias's desk, and Micah didn't tell her. At the mansion, Elias sat in his study for 3 evenings in a row, with the pruning shears lying in front of him, and he never put them away. He thought about the night in the records room, and what troubled him wasn't that she'd lied. People lied to him every day. That was his business. He read lies the way other people read newspapers. What troubled him was realizing that he'd handled her with exactly the same procedure he'd used on Callahan. The same drawer, the same envelope, the same desk, the same short sentence followed by turning away. He had treated a human being exactly the way he treated a risk that needed to be removed from a system. And he'd done it so quickly that he hadn't even stayed long enough to hear her finish what she had to say. During the 2nd week, he carried the tray up to the east wing himself. Rosalind opened the door, looked at the tray in his hands, then turned and sat in the chair by the window without inviting him to sit. She asked where the girl was. He said she no longer worked there. She asked why. He said because she'd entered the house for another purpose, and had hidden that from him. Rosalind was silent for quite a while, then said his father had once thrown someone out for lying too. She asked whether he knew who that person was. Elias said no. She said it was his mother. She told the story briefly, without a single unnecessary word, that his mother had hidden her illness for nearly a year, hidden the paperwork, hidden the doctor's appointments, and when his father found out, he'd shouted in the dining room that he wouldn't live with a liar. She said his mother hadn't argued with him once. She said she'd hidden it because at the time his father was dealing with trouble at the port, and she thought she would let him finish that first. She said people lie for many reasons, son, and some of those reasons are things you wouldn't have to carry for the rest of your life if you were willing to sit still and listen for 3 more minutes. Then she turned her face toward the window, and that was the last thing she said that afternoon. During the 3rd week, Adeline's phone vibrated while she was wiping down a table at the restaurant. The hospital was calling. They told her Micah's numbers that week weren't as good as they'd hoped, and they wanted to increase the number of treatments each week, beginning Monday. She stood still and listened to everything, asked exactly 2 questions, then thanked them and ended the call. She didn't cry. She finished wiping the table she'd been working on, asked permission to step outside for 2 minutes, and sat down on the back steps. She took the small notebook where she tracked her expenses out of her pocket and opened it to the page for that month. She crossed out the line for buying herself a winter coat. Then she turned to the calendar pages in the back, found the only open space left in the week, and wrote in one more shift. The message arrived at the end of the third week, delivered through an intermediary at the fish market, and it was so brief it bordered on insolence. Cormac Halloran wanted to talk, at his warehouse on the southern docks, at 10 o'clock at night, and Elias was to come alone. Rourke objected fiercely during the afternoon meeting, saying that walking onto another man's ground without bringing anyone had never been done by anyone in this family. Elias said he knew. He told Bruno to drive him to the entrance of the docks and remain in the car, and Elias walked the rest of the way himself. At the warehouse door, 2 of Halloran's men told him their boss was busy. Elias nodded and waited. He waited outside, beneath the only floodlight still burning in that part of the harbor, in the wind that came off the water that time of year. He stood there long enough for the 2 men to stop glancing at him, long enough for a tugboat to pass and the sound of its engine to fade into the distance and disappear entirely, long enough to understand that Halloran wasn't busy at all, and that making him stand out there was the first thing Cormac Halloran wanted to say to him. Elias didn't move. When the door finally opened, he walked inside, wearing exactly the expression of a man who had been waiting no more than half a minute. Inside the warehouse, Cormac sat behind a makeshift table set between stacks of crates, one hand resting on the cane he'd used ever since a fall on the pier many years earlier. He didn't stand. He pointed to the chair across from him and said young Barone had been looking thinner lately. The 2 men talked for nearly an hour, and neither raised his voice once. Cormac wanted 3 docks, dock number 4, dock number 6, and the smaller inner dock. Elias said those 3 docks accounted for 1/3 of the Barone family's entire dry freight traffic. Cormac said he knew, and said that wasn't his problem. Elias proposed a profit-sharing arrangement. Cormac shook his head. Elias offered a second arrangement, trading them for an overland route. Cormac shook his head again and said, "Don't waste your time. I don't want your money. I want your position." Then, at the most tense point in the conversation, just after Elias said the Barone family had never surrendered a dock to anyone, Cormac gave a quiet laugh and said something. He said, "Your family is good at holding on to things. I'll give you that. So good that night I actually thought the man sitting in the car that turned left was you." No one in the warehouse said anything after that. The light hanging above them swayed almost imperceptibly. Elias felt the sentence enter his body like cold water, and he knew exactly what it meant, because the fact that 2 cars had left the gates only minutes apart, and which one had turned in which direction, was something that outside of Elias, Bruno, and the man who had died, no one beyond the walls of his home had any reason to know. He didn't move. He didn't blink any faster. He allowed a silence exactly as long as the silences he always used in negotiations, when weighing a price, then said he needed to think about dock number 6. Cormac said he wasn't a patient man. Elias said, "Then take all 3. He stood, buttoned his coat, said his people would transfer the paperwork within the week, and walked out. He walked the entire distance back to the entrance of the docks, got into the car, and closed the door. Bruno waited until they were clear of the harbor before asking, and he asked in the voice of a man who had followed Elias for 11 years and had never once seen him give anything away. He asked, "Why did you give him all 3, sir?" Elias looked out the window for a while, then said he didn't let that slip. Bruno asked what he meant. Elias said Cormac Halloran sat behind that table for nearly an hour, never raised his voice once, never let a single unnecessary word escape him, and then suddenly let slip one detail that no one in this entire city knew. He said men like that don't slip. He said Halloran threw bait into the water to see whether anything would bite. He said if I'd asked him to repeat it, if I'd leaned forward, if my face had changed even a little, he'd have known immediately that I was tracing that night again, and before this night was over, anything that could still be traced would be cleared away, people moved, papers burned, and 3 years from now, I still wouldn't find anything. Bruno drove in silence for a while longer, then said 3 docks is expensive. Elias said 3 docks in exchange for letting him sleep peacefully tonight is cheap. Then he added one more thing, more quietly, almost to himself, that now he knew one thing for certain. Someone inside his own house had told the outside world which car had turned which way that night. The gatekeeper called upstairs on Saturday afternoon to say there was a woman outside asking to see him without an appointment, and she said her name was Adeline Mercer. Bruno asked whether he should send her away. Elias said let her in. She entered the study with her old coat draped over one arm and a small cloth bag in her hand, and she didn't come more than 3 steps past the door. She said she hadn't come to ask for her job back. She said she knew he wouldn't take her back, and she wasn't asking him to. Then she opened the bag, took out something wrapped in a cloth, and placed it on his desk. It was an old model cell phone, the kind with a thick plastic casing that companies used to issue to employees a few years earlier. Its screen scratched, a small faded asset management label stuck to the back. She said this was the work phone the family had issued to her father. She said after that night, people from the office collected all of his work belongings, and she had to return to headquarters again and again for months, asking for them, and every time she was told they were still waiting for reconciliation, until one day someone finally brought the phone out, had her sign for it, and that was the end of it. She said when she got it home, the phone had been wiped clean. No messages, no contacts, no photographs, and it was locked behind a numerical code that she hadn't been able to break, no matter how many combinations she tried. She said she'd put it at the bottom of a box, and hadn't touched it in 3 years, partly because it seemed useless, partly because she couldn't bear sitting down every few months and trying the same meaningless numbers again. Elias asked why she was bringing it now. Adeline said because down in the basement he'd asked what she was looking for, and she'd told him the truth, and he'd fired her anyway. She said she'd thought about that ever since, and eventually understood that he hadn't fired her because she was searching for the logbook. He'd fired her because she'd hidden why she was there. She said so now she was bringing him the last thing she still had that she hadn't told him about. She said she didn't need him to believe her. She only needed him to open it. And once he had, if he wanted to throw her out a second time, that was fine, because she wouldn't come back again. Elias picked up the phone. It was light and cold. He turned it over in his hand, looked at the label on the back, then told Bruno to go bring her younger brother here. An hour later, Micah walked in wearing an oversized sweater with his hair still uncombed, and when he saw his sister standing there, he stopped short. Elias handed him the phone and asked whether he could open it. Micah took it, turned it over several times, held down 2 buttons at once, watched something appear and disappear on the screen, then said with this model, yes, but he'd need a cable and a computer. He said it would take most of an afternoon. Then he added, without looking at Elias, his eyes still on the phone, that the lock was stored on the device itself, rather than through the carrier, which meant the person who locked it was the last person who had been holding it. He worked at the table outside the hallway from that afternoon until close to midnight. Adeline sat in the chair by the door the entire time, her hands resting in her lap, never sleeping, never speaking. Elias didn't send her home, and he didn't invite her to make herself more comfortable. Close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Micah called them over. The old phone's screen was glowing again, a pale blue light falling across his face. He said the phone really had been erased, but only with a quick wipe, which meant the data was still there until something else overwrote it. And because no one had used the phone in 3 years, nothing had ever overwritten it. He said he'd recovered 2 things. The first was an unfinished text message that had never been sent, still sitting in the drafts folder, written on the afternoon of that final day. Micah read it aloud, his voice slowing halfway through. In the message, Thomas Mercer had written that he needed to speak privately with the young master that very night about the routes. He wrote that someone had changed the route without going through him, and that he hadn't wanted to say anything until he was certain, but he didn't feel right about it. The final sentence stopped halfway through, without a period. The second thing was a photograph taken with that same phone, snapped quickly, slightly crooked, under the yellow light of the garage. It showed a ruled page lying open across someone's knees, covered in handwriting, with a date written in the upper corner. Elias stared at the photograph for a long time. He had held that empty cover in his hands inside the records room. This was one of the pages that had been taken from it. Micah enlarged the photograph as far as it would go, and worked on it for more than an hour, brightening it, reducing the noise, straightening the angle, and little by little each line of their father's handwriting emerged on the screen. It was an ordinary shift log page in a way that was almost painful, recording the morning trip, the mileage, the time he stopped for gas. One note saying Hanover was blocked. Then came the final section of the page, the notes, and there the handwriting changed, darker, quicker, as though he'd been writing while his mind was somewhere else. All 3 of them stared at the screen. Adeline read it first, and she read it aloud without realizing she was doing so. Her father hadn't written anyone's name on that page. He had written only 3 words. Ask Mrs. Rosalind. No one in the hallway said anything. Elias stood, walked 3 steps toward the window, then stopped there. He looked outside toward the east wing of the house, where a single window was still lit at this hour just as it had been every night for the past 3 years, and he didn't move again. Bruno looked at him, waiting for an order. No order came. Adeline looked at Elias's back and understood something he himself hadn't been able to say yet, that this man could sit across from Cormac Halloran in a warehouse at 10 o'clock at night without blinking, but he couldn't walk down a hallway and ask his grandmother one question. She said she would go. Elias turned around. He said it wasn't her concern. She said her father had written that line, and he'd written it on the final afternoon of his life, so it was her concern. Then she added more quietly that for 3 weeks the old woman hadn't finished a single tray of food, and the only person in this house who still knocked on the east wing door and waited for her to open it was Adeline. Elias didn't stop her again. Adeline went to the east wing alone. Rosalind opened the door, saw that it was her, and stepped back once as she always had, then turned and sat in the chair beside the window. The dinner tray on the table was untouched. Adeline didn't clear it away. She pulled out the small chair, sat across from her with both hands resting on her lap, and said she'd come upstairs to ask one question. Rosalind didn't ask what question. She only looked at her. Adeline said my father was a driver for this family. My name is Adeline. I'm Thomas's daughter. On the final afternoon of his life, my father wrote a line in his shift log, and in that line he wrote, "Ask Mrs. Rosalind." She said I don't know what he meant to ask you, but I think it had something to do with the route that night. Rosalind sat very still. The hand resting on the arm of her chair began to tremble, the tremor of an old woman, though not entirely the tremor of age. She didn't ask Adeline to repeat herself. She didn't say you've made a mistake. She looked at Adeline for a long time, then said she knew what Thomas had meant to ask. She said that afternoon, she herself had been the one who ordered the route changed. She told it slowly, leaving nothing out, that around midday, Mr. Delaney had come up to the East Wing for tea with her as he did every week, and sometime during the visit he'd said that the route they normally used to take Delphine to music rehearsal was under construction, an entire stretch torn up. Even ambulances were being forced to go around, and he'd suggested that the girl take the other route for safety. She said after hearing that, she'd called downstairs and instructed the driver to use the other road. She said she'd given the instruction in her own voice, the voice no one in this house argued with. She said Thomas had called upstairs once to confirm, and she'd told him simply to do as she said. She said he'd gone quiet. Then she said the sentence Adeline would remember for the rest of her life. She said for 3 years she'd been sitting in this room, waiting for someone to come upstairs and ask her the question Adeline had just asked. She said no one ever had. She said they only brought soup. Adeline couldn't say anything. She sat there in silence, and the old woman sat there in silence, and neither of them stood, neither reached out a hand, neither cried aloud. The light from the lamp fell across the cold dinner tray between them. A long time later, Rosalind finally reached out, opened the drawer of the nightstand, and took out the thing Adeline had seen months earlier, and quietly pushed the drawer closed again. What Rosalind took from the drawer was her own notebook, the kind of small, leather-bound book women of her generation still used to record birthdays and death anniversaries, and she opened it to the exact page for that afternoon, where she'd written the name of the guest who came for tea, and even the instruction she'd given downstairs. She had kept it for 3 years without showing it to anyone. Elias held the notebook in his hands and sat in silence for a long time, then gave Bruno exactly one task: work backward from the name written there. It took Bruno 4 days. He didn't search the Baronne books, because what he needed wouldn't be found there. He went to speak with old men who had retired, asked around at pawnshops on the south side, and found a man who had once kept the books for a gambling house that had since closed. What he brought back wasn't a story about money. Roughly 10 years earlier, Rourke Delaney had lost an amount gambling that a lifetime of working wages could never have repaid, and the Halloran family had stepped in and taken on that debt. But that wasn't the part that made Elias sit in silence. Bruno placed a handwritten sheet on the desk and said Elias's father had known. He said the old man had known from the beginning, known perfectly well, and he hadn't paid the debt for Rourke, nor had he thrown him out. He'd deliberately left the debt where it was, hanging over Rourke Delaney's head like a rope, and he'd told one of his closest men that a man in debt was a loyal man. Elias read that line twice. He thought of himself, of the yellow envelope he'd pushed across the table toward Callahan, of the way he'd sat and eaten with a man for months, while holding everything that man had in the palm of his hand. He knew exactly who he'd learned that from, and he understood something he wouldn't say aloud to anyone for many years afterward, that the rope his father had tied around Rourke Delaney's neck 10 years earlier had eventually been taken up by someone else at the other end and pulled. The Hallorans hadn't bought Rourke with money. They only needed to remind him that they were still holding that rope. And the price they demanded was a single sentence spoken over afternoon tea to an old woman who trusted him. That same week, Bruno brought him something else, something smaller, but it made Elias rise abruptly from his chair. One of his people at the hospital had reported an unusual query in the system. Someone had used the account of an unrelated department to open Micah Mercer's treatment file, look at his appointment schedule, then log out. Only once. Nothing had been changed. Nothing had been taken. Elias stood at the window for about a minute. He didn't call anyone and order a search. He didn't send guards to stand outside the hospital doors. In the course of a single night, he did 3 things. First, he called a doctor the Barone family had known since his father's time, and by the following morning, Micah's entire file had been transferred to another facility on the west side of the city, with the treatment schedule kept exactly the same. Not a single appointment changed, and no one told the boy why. He was only told the location was being changed because it was closer to home, and he believed it because it really was closer. Second, Elias found the security company the Halloran family was using, then called the owner directly close to midnight and reminded him of something old, something the Barone family had done for him back when he'd first opened his business, the thing without which he wouldn't have had a company today. Elias didn't threaten him, he only reminded him. The next morning, that company terminated its contract with the client on the south side for internal reasons. Third, Elias wrote a note and had it delivered directly into Cormac Halloran's hands. On it was an address. The address of the house where Cormac's son lived with his wife and 2 children. Written in full, accurate down to the apartment number. Beneath it, Elias wrote exactly 1 line. I know. I won't use it. You don't either. Bruno read the note before taking it away and asked whether this meant they had crossed that line after all. Elias said no. He said crossing the line would mean going there. This was letting the other man know exactly where he would stop. Then that night, sitting alone in his study with his grandmother's leather notebook on his left and Bruno's handwritten paper on his right, Elias heard his own voice again from the meeting months earlier, the sentence he'd said to everyone at the table, about the 3 places that were never to be touched, about how people were in those places because they had nowhere else left to run. He looked down at the 2 pieces of paper. Rourke Delaney hadn't touched a school, hadn't touched a hospital, hadn't touched a church. He had only sat drinking tea with an old woman, spoken 1 sentence, then pulled a stack of pages out of the logbook cover on the 7th shelf, and taken the money that should have reached 2 orphaned children. He had taken away an entire family's room to breathe, without ever needing to step outside this house. Adeline's screening to see whether she could donate to her younger brother had begun before any of this happened, back in the summer of the previous year, and she hadn't told anyone. Not Micah, not anyone at the old hospital except the 1 person who needed to know, and later she didn't tell Elias either. She completed each round of testing on mornings she had free between 2 shifts, walking from one place to another so she wouldn't have to spend money on transportation, and she waited. The final result came back on a Wednesday afternoon, not long after Micah's records had been transferred to the new facility. They called her in. The doctor was a woman about the age her mother would have been, and she didn't soften it. She said Adeline wasn't eligible. Adeline asked her to repeat it, and the doctor did, then explained slowly and clearly that the problem wasn't whether or not she was a match for her brother. The problem was Adeline herself. She asked how many hours Adeline had been sleeping each night for the past several years. Adeline couldn't answer. She asked what she ate, whether there was ever a meal she cooked specifically for herself, whether she'd seen a doctor for her own health even once in the past 3 years. Adeline sat in silence. The doctor put the papers down and said something Adeline would hear again in her head for months afterward, that she'd used up her own body before she ever had the chance to give it to someone else. She said Adeline was still young, that she could recover if she was willing to start treating herself properly, but not now. Right now, they couldn't allow her to do it, and allowing it would only harm her. Adeline said thank you, stood, and walked out into the waiting room. Micah was sitting there with his legs stretched out, the old laptop open on his lap, and the moment he looked up and saw her face, he closed it immediately. He asked what happened. She sat down beside him. She said they wouldn't let her. He asked why not, quickly, his voice rising, and she said because of me. He looked at her. She said it's not because of you. It's not because our blood doesn't match. It's because of me." Then she told him something she hadn't told anyone in 8 years. She said, "Do you remember the year Mom died?" Micah said he did. She said, "That year I was in my 2nd year of nursing school. And that spring I got the scholarship I'd applied for during my 1st year, the one that covered tuition and housing. And the acceptance letter came the same week Mom went into the hospital for the last time." She said, "I carried that letter into the hospital in my coat pocket." Micah sat very still. She said, "You were sitting in the hallway where those blue chairs were. You were 8 years old, holding a carton of milk you weren't drinking, and I was standing a few steps away from you." She said, "I took the letter out of my pocket, tore it up, tore it into 4 pieces, and dropped it into the trash can at the end of the hallway. I thought you didn't see me." Micah said, "I did see you." Adeline stopped. He said, "I saw you tear up some piece of paper, and later you told me you hadn't passed, so I thought it was a rejection letter. And I didn't ask because I was afraid it would make you sad." She sat there in silence for a very long time. Then she said it wasn't a rejection letter. She said, "I got in, Micah. I got in, and I tore it up because Mom was about to be gone, and there was no one left in the house except you and me, and that scholarship was in another state." She said, "I've lied to you for 8 years because I didn't want you growing up thinking I gave something up because of you." She said, "And now I understand that I hurt you in an even worse way." Micah didn't say anything. He sat there with both hands resting on the closed laptop, and his shoulders began to shake. He was the boy who had read his own spreadsheet aloud to his sister without changing his voice. The boy who had sat in that small room in Chelsea and spoken the numbers showing how few hours she slept without shedding a single tear. The boy who had looked a man like Elias Barone in the face and asked whether he was repaying a debt or buying peace of mind. Now he cried. He cried the way a 16-year-old boy cries when he's trying not to. His face lowered, one hand lifted across his forehead. He said, "I always thought the reason you couldn't go to school was me." She said, "It wasn't you." He said, "For 8 years I thought it was." She put an arm around his shoulders and said, "I know, and I'm sorry." And it was the most sincere apology she'd ever given anyone in her life. The brother and sister sat together on the waiting room bench until someone called his name to go inside. Elias wouldn't hear the story of that torn letter until much later, and when he finally did, he wouldn't hear it from her. It was Rosalind herself who told Elias about the torn letter. On the evening, Adeline went up to the East Wing and sat with her for a long time without saying much. When she finished telling him, Rosalind was quiet for a while, then asked what he intended to do with Mr. Delaney. Elias said he had enough ways to end it within a week and leave nothing for anyone to find. The old woman nodded as though she'd expected that answer. Then she said, "If you do that, you'll be the same as he is." She said, "If you put him before the law, then you'll be one step above him, and that step is the only thing this family has left." He said the law had never been kind to his family. She said she knew. Then she told him to think about which choice Delphine would make, and she didn't say another word for the rest of that evening. The family council met on Friday afternoon, with everyone present, including several of the older men who hadn't attended in a long time. Elias didn't begin with an accusation. He opened the door and told Micah to come in. The boy walked into the middle of that room wearing his oversized sweater, holding his old laptop against his chest, and he set it on the table and said he would present everything in chronological order. He showed them the photograph of the shift log page. He showed them the unsent draft message. He showed them Rosalind's leather notebook, the part where she'd recorded that afternoon tea. He showed them the 3 identical signatures on 3 documents his sister had only signed once. Rourke Delaney sat at the far end of the table with his hands clasped as always, and when Micah reached the 3rd document, he interrupted and said, "Gentlemen, we are sitting here listening to a 16-year-old boy teach us about records." Elias didn't raise his voice. He said, "This boy found in one night what you buried for 3 years. He said you will sit there and listen to the rest, because the next part has your name in it." The next part did have his name in it. Bruno read out the debt from 10 years earlier, read the name of the people who had taken it on, and even read the handwritten line saying Elias's father had known and deliberately left it unpaid. Chairs shifted in the room. Rourke listened to all of it without changing expression, and when Bruno finished, he opened his briefcase, took out a packet of papers, and placed it lightly on the table, the way someone lays down a final card. He said he had records too. He asked who had signed off on the port payments for the past 3 years, who had signed transportation contracts no one dared examine closely, who had put his name at the bottom of every page. He said the name on those papers is Elias Barone, not mine. He said if this goes to court, I go, but you go with me. Then he sat back down and gave his final offer. that Elias could withdraw everything. This would end inside this room. Rourke would disappear from the city, and the Barone family would remain intact. No one in the room breathed heavily. Elias sat in silence for a long time. He thought about the previous Wednesday afternoon, about the hospital waiting room, about the woman who had just been told she'd used up her own body before she ever had the chance to give it to someone else. He knew perfectly well that if he withdrew, then the following week he would still have the mansion, still have the docks, still have enough money to care for the brother and sister for the rest of their lives. And he knew just as clearly that if he didn't withdraw, then at the very moment she was at her lowest, he would be the one standing up and walking away. He chose not to withdraw. He told everyone at the table that the entire file, including the parts bearing his own name, would be turned over to the federal prosecutor that week, and the Barone family would cooperate fully. Rourke gave a short laugh, then stopped when he saw Elias's face. In the days that followed, Elias worked with almost no sleep. He transferred every legitimate part of the business, the port logistics company and the warehouses that were still clean, into a foundation bearing the names Delphine Barone and Thomas Mercer, with Rosalind named to oversee it and clear instructions that the foundation was to support education and medical care for the families of employees. The rest he couldn't keep. It was sealed, inventoried, and in the end, even the 32-room mansion in the North End was placed on the list to be sold. The night before he was due to surrender himself, Adeline was in the kitchen washing the last few glasses when he walked in. He stood on the other side of the kitchen table and didn't come any closer. He said, "Tomorrow I go." She said, "I know." He said, "They told me a little more than a year, maybe longer." Then he said, "You don't owe me any promises." He said, "Don't wait, don't write letters, don't rearrange your life around this, because I don't deserve that from you, and you've already spent enough of your life doing that for other people." Adeline set the glass down. She started to say something, but he continued, and for the first time his voice didn't sound like the voice of the man who always sat at the head of the table, in rooms with closed doors. He said, "I'm only asking you for one thing." He said, "Don't let the boy think I left him." Then he turned and walked out, and the kitchen door closed very softly behind him, exactly the way another door had closed many months earlier, behind a man carrying his daughter's school enrollment paper, as he walked out of the small dining room. The call came on a late winter morning that year while Adeline was folding towels at the laundry. The hospital said there was a kidney for Micah, from an anonymous donor, and they needed him there within 4 hours. The transplant took place that night and was successful. When he woke, the first thing he did was ask whether his sister had eaten anything, and Adeline laughed and cried at the same time. The first time in 3 years she'd cried without having to hide it from anyone. Throughout that time, money came regularly from the foundation bearing the names of 2 people who had died, covering the hospital bills and the rent, approved each month by an old woman in Somerville, in her trembling handwriting. Adeline returned to nursing school in the fall, taking evening classes, and Micah went back to school and applied to study computer science. 14 months after that night in the kitchen, the brother and sister stood waiting outside the gates of a federal prison in the western part of the state. Micah was now half a head taller than his sister, holding the keys to the old car parked beside the road, the same car he'd once learned to drive in circles around the estate yard. When Elias walked out, he was thinner. There was far more gray in his hair, and he stopped for a second when he saw the 2 of them. Micah was the first to walk forward. He didn't hug him. He handed Elias an envelope and said, "This came to the house last month. They said the tissue bank has a procedure, and if the donor agrees to reveal their identity, then the recipient's family is allowed to know." Elias opened it. Inside was a document from the hospital and a handwritten note. The name on the document belonged to the woman who had divorced Rourke Delaney many years earlier. The woman whose name had been used all that time to front a shell company that swallowed the money meant for 2 orphaned children. A woman who hadn't known any of it until she sat in the back row of the courtroom and heard her own name read aloud. On the handwritten note, she had written exactly 1 line. "My name was once used to take away your future, so I wanted to use it properly once to save it." When Elias finished reading, he had to turn his face away for a while. The house in Somerville was small, 2 stories, with a backyard just large enough for a table and a few potted plants. Micah had rebuilt the greenhouse there, not a large one, with a wooden frame he'd made himself and glass bought from a building salvage shop, and in the center stood the lemon tree he'd dug up and brought from the old garden, its trunk still twisted, but its leaves now green and thick. The afternoon Elias came home, Micah led him out there, took the pruning shears with the wooden handles from the potting bench where they had been kept safe, and placed them into Elias's hands. Elias took them. No one said anything. Their wedding took place on a Saturday morning in that very yard, with no guests, no photographer, only Rosalind sitting in a chair placed against the wall, Bruno standing by the gate, as he'd stood for so many years, and Micah serving as the witness. Before it began, Rosalind reached out, cut a small lemon branch with 2 leaves, and tucked it into Elias's lapel. And she said a tree knows what it needs to let go of. Son, and what it needs to keep, it keeps. This story leaves us with a few things worth thinking about together. No one in this world has the right to measure their own worth by the cost they create for someone else, because a human being isn't a line in a spreadsheet, and their value lies in who they can still become, not in how much they are costing someone today. What people in the hardest circumstances often lack isn't a miracle, but simply someone willing to open the door, willing to sit down, willing to ask one more question and listen to the entire answer before turning away. And finally, a name, a little power, a signature, all of them are double-edged swords. They can be used to take away a person's future, and they can also be used, just once and in the right way, to save that future. What gives each of us dignity is the way we choose to use what we have. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about the story of Elias and Adeline? And if you were in their place, what would you choose? Please leave a few lines in the comments, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.